So good evening, and thank you all for being here tonight to discuss parole in Maine and what it would look like to reinstate it. My name is Nicole Lund, and for those of you who weren't here last week for the presentation on mass incarceration, I'd like to briefly share with you why I care so much about prison reform. I have been both victim and offender. I am a survivor of violent crime and a person in recovery from opioid addiction. Through my lived experience, I became deeply aware of the flaws and injustices in our nation's carceral system. When I was a young adult, I faced a potential 15-year sentence in Massachusetts State Women's Prison, but the judge decided, instead of locking me up, he would grant me leniency. I served 2 years probation with mandatory outpatient drug treatment counseling. I was very lucky to not have served those 15 years inside a state prison, but I have many friends who are not so lucky. Some died while incarcerated, and some are still incarcerated. Many people are not given a second chance like I was, which is why I'm here tonight to talk about parole. We're going to start this talk by defining what parole actually is, because I've learned recently that a lot of people don't know. And often when people do, they assume it's something we have in Maine because it's such common sense that we would. And the irony is, we do have parole in Maine, just not for Maine residents. Maine has a parole board in place since prisoners from other states have been relocated to Maine and are given the chance for parole as part of their sentence. However, Maine residents do not benefit from this board. It only exists for out-of-staters. We'll talk about the history of parole, why we stopped, and why we really need to bring it back. At the end of the presentation, we will open things up for discussion, questions, and answers. So let's start with some definitions. What is parole, and how is it different from probation? Probation is when part of a person's sentence is served in the community under supervision. Probation is built into the initial sentence. If you've heard of split sentencing, this is where probation comes into play. When somebody has been sentenced to 9 years, all but 5 suspended, they will serve 5 years in prison, and the remaining 4 are probation. During that probation period, they are under supervision in the community, and if they violate the terms of their probation, they will go back to prison to serve the remainder of their sentence. Parole is different. You have to earn parole. Parole refers to the supervised release of prisoners before the completion of their full sentence at the discretion of a parole board. Most people have heard the phrase 25 to life. That 25 years is the minimum amount of time incarcerated, and after 25 years has been served, the person can go before a parole board and plead their case as to why they deserve to be released back into the community. And even if they are granted parole and are released into the community, it would be under strict supervision with a set of guidelines they must adhere to. Otherwise, they'll be sent back to prison. So it was in the early 20th century when the Justice Department came up with this concept of discretionary parole. It was created to be used together with indeterminate sentencing. Judges sentence people to an indeterminate amount of time in prison, including a minimum and a maximum number of years. People became eligible for parole review when they reached the minimum of this range. And so why was parole started in the first place? Because everybody is different. And a judge at the time of sentencing has no way of knowing how long it will take a person to rehabilitate. Parole incentivizes good behavior, and if a person knows they have a chance at getting out, they're more willing to address their behaviors and take steps towards recovery. Prison populations were growing, creating a burden on the taxpayer, and we needed a way to manage this. It was realized at the time parole was created that it's unnecessary to keep somebody incarcerated past the point of them being a threat to society. People age out of crime. Parole also ensures a harsh, lengthy sentence cannot be used as cruel and unusual punishment. Because parole requires the individual to meet certain criteria, it helps facilitate successful reentry. If somebody has completed an educational or vocational training program, therapeutic treatments appropriate for their situation, and has acquired employment and stable housing, and has accountability check-ins post-release, they're much more likely to stay out of prison than if they're just thrown out in the streets with none of these things. So with all these benefits, why would we ever have gotten rid of parole? Well, in 1976, Maine abolished parole in an effort to elevate public perception of the criminal justice system. President Nixon had called for a war on drugs, and in the following decade, President Reagan continued and built upon Nixon's initiative, passing new policies based on fear-mongering and imagined threats to public safety. A nationwide push was made for harsher sentencing in what became known as truth in sentencing laws. Truth in sentencing laws severely limit or eliminate the ability of offenders to reduce their sentence through good behavior, parole, or earned good time. Nationally, we have seen a 500% increase in the prison population since this time, largely due to increased severity in sentencing. Even though crime rates are declining, prison populations are on the rise. Overcrowding in prisons has become a significant issue and raises safety concerns for the residents, as well as staff, and further inflates costs. There's no consistency in sentencing, and harsh sentences are being used as cruel and unusual punishment. The reason we started parole so long ago was to prevent exactly these issues. Abolishing parole led to a massive increase in the number of Mainers in prison, despite no increase in crime rates. An unprecedented expansion of life without parole sentences, racial disparity in sentencing. Although Black Americans make up only 13% of the total U.S. population, they represent 40% of the U.S. prison population. And there are no pathways for the Department of Corrections to recognize rehabilitation with appropriate and safe release dates prior to the conclusion of the sentence. This reform was so disastrous that the Department of Corrections argued for the reinstatement of parole soon after it was abolished. So after sentencing, a convicted person has only 1 year to file a post-conviction review. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of trauma for a person getting sentenced to prison. It's not a pleasant transition. So if the person isn't able to navigate this legal process and get themselves before a judge within that first year, then that's it. The only way they can proceed with any kind of appeal is if new evidence is presented and the incarcerated individual is somehow made aware of this new evidence. So given the rate at which felonies are exonerated, the estimated rate of wrongful convictions is 3.5%. So given the state of Maine's current prison population, that would mean well over 100 people are currently sitting in prison who have been wrongfully convicted and have no way to get a second look at their case. Under the bill being proposed, parole in Maine would look like this. After serving 1/3 of their sentence, or 5 full years, whichever is longer, any incarcerated adult in Maine would be eligible to apply for parole. These applications would be reviewed by a diverse board of professionals with experience in relevant fields. The parole board would then decide whether or not the applicant could re-enter their community under Maine Department of Corrections supervision. If denied, the parole board would set a time at which the applicant would be able to reapply with specific reasons for denial provided by the board. Parole offers a huge economic benefit for the taxpayers in our state. It costs taxpayers $78,000 to incarcerate a single individual in Maine for a single year. This means one person sentenced to life at 20 years old costs $3.9 million to incarcerate that one person for their life. Parole is estimated to cost only 10 to 12% of this amount. Harsher, longer sentences have a minimal effect on deterrence, while increasing the adverse psychological effects of incarceration. We talked about deterrence a bit last week. In order for something to be a deterrent, a person needs to know what the punishment is. Then they need to be able to rationally stop and think clearly that if they do this thing, then this punishment might happen. Anyone who is suffering from substance abuse disorder, about to commit an act of violence, is not thinking clearly. And given that young people are generally the ones to commit acts of violence, they're also the least likely to be aware of sentencing in their state. Parole actually lowers the rate of recidivism versus non-parole release by incentivizing participation in programs which are proven to reduce recidivism. Programs such as drug treatment counseling and education are crucial to a person's recovery and rehabilitation. 95% of people in prison will be released regardless of if they have proven they're ready to re-enter the community or not. Parole incentivizes engaging in programs that promote safe and effective reentry. There are multiple provisions that afford care, consideration, and protection to victims of crime, including but not limited to protection through individualized conditions, sensitive and trauma-informed notification of parole process, notification of rights and available support services, and choice in if, when, and how to participate in the process. Truth in sentencing and other tough-on-crime policies are often enacted in the name of crime victims. But the reality is, most victims of violence prefer that money is spent on violence prevention, not incarceration. When asked if they prefer holding people accountable by being punished in prison or held accountable through restorative justice, community service, and mental health treatment, 75% preferred the latter. 80% of victims prefer investing in mental health treatment over prisons. 72% are in favor of incentives for pre-release related to rehabilitation. 71% would prefer to reduce the jail population by releasing those who can safely await trial in the community or serve their sentence through diversion, community service, or treatment programs. Parole offers taxpayer relief, better public safety, racial justice, and represents a belief in second chances and redemption. Here are some testimonials from Mainers who would be eligible for parole under our bill. Any society is better when it allows hope. Without this, it is easy for cycles of despair to set in. Therefore, creating sources of hope, motivation, and worth are vital aspects of a healthy community, vital for society as a whole, but also for the community of incarcerated people. While they may often be overlooked, people serving time in institutions are still a part of society. Providing opportunities for rehabilitated people to interact with and grow with regular communities could only lead to the betterment of both sides. Any improvement of our understanding of one another is a step in the right direction. That was from someone fortunate enough to be going home, a fortune sadly not shared with everyone incarcerated. The opportunity to be considered for parole would allow us to demonstrate to society and to those we harmed personally our ability to grow, change, offer healing, and become contributing members of society. Reinstating parole would allow us to help rectify and address the stain of mass incarceration. Maine would be using resources already in place to better the lives of our residents. Parole would reunite families, better the economy, reduce prison spending, and allow people who have been rehabilitated a second chance. It's time to build a more compassionate society that rewards the efforts of those who have worked hard to learn from and correct from their mistakes. So I began my advocacy work as a volunteer art teacher at the Maine State Prison, and I want to share with you this beautiful metal sculpture my friend Josh made there that summer. This piece is titled "The Gift of Second Chances," and the artist statement he wrote for it always sticks with me. Josh wrote, "This is a TIG-welded aluminum gift box with the word second chance inside. The box also features an EKG line inside, which represents the fragile nature of life. I hope that my work will inspire people to cherish the remarkable gift of second chances they have been given. I also hope that it will remind people never to take anything for granted, especially their loved ones. I believe that art can be a powerful tool for communication and expression. I hope that my work will evoke a sense of hope and inspiration in my viewers. I want my art to make people think about the preciousness of life and the importance of living each day to the fullest." So thank you all for being here tonight, and I'd like to open things up for any discussion, questions, or answers. Thank you. Did anyone have any questions? Mm-hmm. Sure. So at the time, Nixon, they started the big war on drugs campaign, and there was a lot of fear mongering basically going on. There was a lot of inconsistent with drug sentencing. There was this whole fear of like the super predator, and it was a time when they started using prison as like a wedge issue in politics. So this whole like concept of like public safety and needing to like keep people safe, and the war on drugs too was very much like a racialized issue. Even at the inconsistency in sentencing between like powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, I forget, it was like 100 times more like of a sentence. So like if you were caught with powdered cocaine, which was more expensive, it was considered like white people drugs basically, then it was a significantly less sentence than if you were caught with crack cocaine, which is less pure and cheaper, and was attributed to people of color. So there were just all these things happening, and they got really harsh in sentencing in trying to elevate this perception of the criminal justice system. And so that was when many, many states abolished parole at that time, many of which have since reinstated it. There are currently 16 states without parole, and Maine is one of them. So did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so it's an interesting point you're bringing up, right? Because, I mean, you think about how people are treated in prison and the food, which is terrible, and they don't get enough of it, and all these things. And, you know, they say they don't have solitary confinement, but the guys get locked in a lot of times for, you know, hours, and I mean, for solitary confinement amount numbers of times, and it really, really affects, you know, their mental health and how they're feeling. And even I know for myself, like talking to guys inside, like I can tell if they've been locked in all day or if they got to go to the gym that day and all these sorts of things. And like, you know, we put people in cages and treat them like wild animals, and then we wonder why they act like wild animals. But yeah, so that. Oh, the judges. I didn't hear that.
Yeah, in case people in the audience didn't hear, what Anstis is saying is that the parole board members were much more likely to parole someone after they'd had lunch than before they'd had lunch, which is kind of a commentary on the critical thinking of parole boards and whether or not, what exactly are they weighing in order to decide whether someone is ready for release or not. Yeah, that could be one.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I heard you wrong. I thought you were saying that the guys that were up for parole were more likely because they were like irritable or something when they went in front of the parole board. The judges, jeez. Oh, yep, Max.
Would it cost more or less to reinstate parole? Would it cost more to reinstate parole than
Parole would cost significantly less than what we have now. It costs $78,000 a year to keep somebody locked up. And parole costs like 10% of that, because all you're really doing is paying a parole officer who will be managing, hopefully, a whole bunch of guys that have been released. So you're no longer housing them and feeding them and security and everything else on these people. So yeah, it would be a hell of a lot less.
In addition to that, there are lots of economic benefits to adding more people to the workforce. They can also support their families who may be living in poverty because their primary breadwinner is in prison or jail. So we would expect there would be less government supports that would be needed for family members, and that the individual who's released will be able to become a tax-paying citizen instead of a drain on taxes. Go ahead, Matt.
Would they be like supervised at
Supervision is usually a weekly check-in and surprise visits to your home. So you have as many as 27 different conditions that you have to meet. You have to check in with your parole officer if you're in any way deviating from the schedule. You have to live in a house that has no alcohol or drugs on the premises. You have to be willing to have someone come in at any time and search your house for any kinds of things that are on the list that you're not supposed to have. Sometimes, depending on the charge, you may not have access to a computer. You have to go right home from work unless you have already cleared it with your parole or probation officer. You can't leave the state of Maine. Goes on and on and on. But so the supervision itself is usually a weekly check-in. Either you go to the office or they arrange some other way to do that. And you also may be required to take courses in the community. If you are a sex offender, you'll have to complete a sex offender course in the community. If you're someone with a domestic violence assault, you'll have to complete that course in the community. You may be required to take counseling. There's just a long list of things you may be required to do while you're out on probation or parole. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the bill? We're going to talk about
Nicole's trying to duck out on this one. Yes, there is a bill that's presented that we'll be submitting again in this legislative session. You can find it at parole4, the number 4, me.org online. And I just want to kind of give some perspective on this, because Nicole was kind enough to actually admit that she'd broken the law before. Is there anyone here who has never broken the law? Not gone over the speed limit, not maybe used something illegal, maybe shoplifted on a dare, something. Is there anyone who's never done any of those things? Speeding, yeah, speeding, that counts too. Yeah. Okay, so generally we can say with pretty good surety that if you've reached the age of, say, 20, you've probably broken the law somewhere along the way. And lucky you didn't get caught, right? Which is the way the system is set up, right? Because you can't have eyes on everybody at all the time. So you know some people are going to get away with breaking the law. And then some people are going to get caught. So what do you think would increase your chances of getting caught? Claudia? And why? Why? But why is somebody of color getting caught more often than you are? Okay, so that's one way, is you can get targeted because of your skin color. We know that there have been cases in the state of Maine where an officer will just see somebody driving while black and pull them over just because they're black. And we also know that we police areas where people of color live more. So we put more police there. If you have more police in a certain area, they're more likely to see stuff going on, right? So even though people of color and people who are white both use drugs with the same frequency, you're 7 times more likely to get caught, prosecuted, and sentenced if you're black. So there are other things that can also make you much more likely to go to prison. And one of them is whether or not you have health care. If you do not have health care, you are 7 times more likely to end up in jail or prison. Why is that? I'm a teacher, I'm waiting for you to answer. Want to guess? Great. So there's one thing. There's several things that can contribute to that, but one of them is that you don't have the money, 1, to pay bail, 2, to pay an attorney. So people who have money can get a good attorney. People who don't have money, especially in Maine, not a good situation, because we do not have trained defense attorneys. We have a process called lawyer for the day, which means, you know, whoever the lawyer is that's assigned to be in court that day is the one who's going to convince you to plea deal, because there's not enough defense attorneys in the state of Maine. In fact, the Justice Department and the ACLU of Maine are suing the state of Maine because they don't meet their constitutional requirements for providing an attorney for people who are indigent. So that's going to not be in your favor, right? If you don't have the money to have an attorney and you don't have the money to pay bail, you're probably more likely to plea deal if you're stuck in jail because you don't have money for bail and you want to get out, so you might plea deal because it'll get you out a lot faster. And then you'll have a record, whether or not you did it. How about looking at the people who actually are incarcerated? What's the #1 crime that you'll go to prison for across the country? You got it, drugs. Good guess. So drugs, if you have a substance use disorder and you need treatment, but you don't have health insurance, and why do people take drugs? Not usually, but often there is an underlying mental health disorder. And so you have a mental health disorder and you don't have health care. You are much more likely to self-medicate. What does that mean? You're going to take something that makes you feel better, and that might be something that's illegal. So now you also have a second condition, substance use disorder, which is much more likely to occur if you've been a victim of abuse. So you don't have health insurance, so where do you end up? In jail and prison, right? So a large percentage of the people who are incarcerated have a mental health disorder, and they also have a substance use disorder. The reason why I'm bringing this up is neither of those things are going to be treated in prison. But if we instead actually provided the resources in our community for people with those disorders, we could drastically lower the number of people who are in prison or jail in the United States. And we could help people get better instead of just locking them up. So another good reason for parole is that we can help people get better in our communities and heal our communities if we can do parole.
Okay, do you have a question? I'm sorry, what? Yeah, so young people, and that's kind of one of the problems. So young people are more, they're more impulsive, and they end up getting these very long sentences. So we have a lot of young people that are getting incarcerated, so like under 25. And then they end up there depending on what their charges were until they're very old. And they never really had a chance to make an amends or grow up, basically. And where people do tend to age out of crime, it's a shame because you have somebody who will, get like a really harsh sentence, somebody arrested at like 20, 21, get 50 years. I mean, it's not going to take 50 years for them to no longer be a threat to the community. Mm-hmm. Do you have a question? Yes. Yes, write letters to the government and to the representatives and tell them that this is something that we want in our state. We want parole, we want supervised community confinement or something to get these people out of prison and back into the communities where they can get help and get treatment and be reunited with their families. Absolutely. And talk to people too. In those pamphlets that we handed out too, there's lots of resources and lots of information and websites and podcasts and books. And there's so much information out there that addresses these issues and talks about it. So you can educate yourself and educate your friends and family. Because I think prison was one of those things that people, like a lot of people just don't even think about it, right? And like prisons are designed that way for people to not think about them. They're always put in rural, like, back places where like you don't really drive by prisons, you don't see them very often, and people just don't think about them. And the way that the media portrays many people when they commit crimes, it's awful, and it's not it's not really truthful to the situation. So I think people a lot of times are like, oh well, if they went to prison they must have deserved it. But really, like, there's so much more to the people involved and to the cases than what any article in the Portland Press Herald or anywhere else will really let on.